Okay, so we made it back home to Houston, and here we are with week 7 of the 2020 Bible reading. Still doing the live videos. We've just gotten home, new baby. You may even hear him crying in the background. So this is just easier to do for the time being. But we're going to be talking about the last part of the book of Exodus and the first part of the book of Leviticus. We mentioned last week that this gets into the very tough section of reading. This is the stretch where many Bible reading plans go to die. This February, March stretch when you get into the thick of the law of Moses and the building of the tabernacle, the offerings and the instructions for the sacrifices and the rituals and the laws and all that kind of stuff. So I just encourage you to stick with it. And again, we're going to try to, if I can't make it easier to read, maybe make it a little bit easier to understand and to put into the big picture of what's going on. Okay, so let's talk about Exodus first. Remember that Exodus, really, there's two parts of the book. There's the getting to Mount Sinai, which is all the story of the Exodus and the plagues that we've already gotten through the Red Sea. And then there is the what happens at Sinai, which is the giving of the law, and then the instructions for the tabernacle. And then, as we see this week, the building of the tabernacle. And to that point, we see in this second half of Exodus at Mount Sinai somewhat of a sandwich structure to the text, which is that last week we had all of these chapters about the instructions for building the tabernacle. And then there is, in this week's reading, a bunch of descriptions of how all those instructions were completed. That's kind of the two outer halves. And then in the middle, there's the famous story of the golden calf incident and all of the aftermath of that. So let's talk about the outer parts of that. We do see a lot of repetition in this week's reading from last week's. Remember last week's reading, God, through Moses, called for an offering for the people to bring the materials needed to build the tabernacle. And in this week's reading, we see the people fulfilling that request by bringing really more than enough for a contribution for the building of the tabernacle. We saw last week the subcontracting, so to speak, of the construction to the craftsmen. And we see this of the instructions being that God was communicating his blueprint to the people of how he wanted everything to be in the tabernacle. The theme of this week's reading would be that they did that as the Lord had commanded. In fact, that's a repeated phrase. And you think about how all that fits. Remember that the book of Exodus is getting to Sinai, and then what happens at Sinai is all about God bringing his people out of slavery in order to make a covenant with them, to establish a relationship with them. And the tabernacle is central to that relationship because that's where he's going to dwell. And so the significance of the tabernacle is that it is this heavenly blueprint. It is this model of the presence of God that will dwell among people. And so in order to make that possible, they have to construct it exactly as he had commanded them to. And that's what we see. And so, again, that theme of God dwelling, resting with his people is emphasized. That's really what this is all about, God dwelling with his people. Now, what's in the middle? In the middle, we have an interesting, maybe focal point of this section, because it's a failure of the people. In the middle of all this, in the middle of the instructions of how God will dwell among his people, we see that they sin by building an idol, disregarding multiple of the 10 commandments, the building of graven images, the worshiping of other gods. And the language of the text is that there was likely sexual sin that was at the center of this celebration that they had in worship of the golden calf. And so we have multiple brazen disobediences of the 10 commandments right at the middle of this passage about God dwelling with his people. But right after that, we have this just amazing declaration of the character of God. And so we have the people sinning, And God, his wrath is burning against these people. He's ready to wipe them out. We have Moses interceding, and we have God reiterating his character, reiterating that he is a God who is slow to anger and abounding in loving kindness, and that he is a God that will show steadfast love from generation to generation, that he will hold them accountable for their guilt. And we see that even in this section as the Levites go out and enact this punishment of God within the camp. But yet he is committed to his people, that in spite of their sin, he remains faithful to show them forgiveness and steadfast love. So that really marks, I think, a profound center to this second half of the book of Exodus, where we have God going to dwell with his people. His presence is going to be in the tabernacle. Notice the presence of God is such a big theme throughout these chapters, whether it's him communicating with Moses face to face and Moses' face glowing because he has been in the presence of God, or the cloud that comes down once the tabernacle is completed, demonstrating the presence of God in the tabernacle. This is what the book of Exodus is all about, God's presence with his people. But in the middle of that, we're told that the people he has chosen to dwell among, the people of Israel, are, as he describes them, a stiff-necked people, a rebellious people that from the beginning turn against him and kick back against him and disregard his commandments. And yet he remains faithful to them because of this covenant. And he is committed to loving them, committed to forgiving them. And that whole incident with the golden calf and his response to that, and Moses' response to that, and God's reiteration of that promise to them shows that it is the character of God, the faithful, merciful character of God that really is making this covenant possible where he can dwell among them. Okay, now going then to the book of Leviticus, first of all, we want to notice that Leviticus is just a continuation of the story in Exodus. The first verse of the book of Leviticus says that God came to Moses at the tent of meeting. So the tabernacle's been constructed, and now God will come and give these instructions that we find in the book of Leviticus to Moses. And carrying on or developing maybe the story and the theme of Exodus, if Exodus is all about God's plan to dwell among his people and for his presence to be among them, well, how is that going to happen? Well, we've talked about his character being central to that. But for the people, how is it that they can dwell with God in their presence? Well, it's going to take them being holy, and holiness really is the central idea of the book of Leviticus. And we'll probably talk more about that in next week's video when we're reading in order for a holy God to dwell in their midst. And so it would make sense then that the beginning of the book of Leviticus, as we see this week, is all about the sacrifices. And there are various types of offerings and sacrifices that are described in the first 7 chapters of Leviticus. And that would make sense to us. We are familiar with this idea of sacrifice and the blood that is needed to atone for sin. And so if the people are going to have God dwell among them, then they have to have their sins atoned for. But notice that in those offerings, it is not just mandatory sacrifices for the atonement of sin, for sin and for guilt. There are those sacrifices that are described, but there are also sacrifices that are simply free will offerings and peace offerings given out of the heart to worship God and to celebrate that fellowship that the people have with him. And that is also involved in this relationship, not just the atoning for sin, but the freely giving, the voluntary sacrifice of giving up what belongs to a person in celebration of that covenant relationship, that covenant fellowship they have with God, and sharing, that word fellowship meaning sharing. Sharing really is at the heart of these sacrifices. Not only are the people giving up what they have, they're bringing what they have to share with God, and the language of that aroma going up before God, of a meal that is maybe metaphorically being partaken in by God, but even the priests with several of these offerings, eating of the meal, eating of the sacrifice themselves is a mark of the fellowship, the sharing that is taking place between God and his people, and the priests being the mediators of that. And so Exodus showing us God's commitment to dwelling among his people, to his presence being with the people of Israel, to Leviticus, and that only being possible through holiness and sacrifices being central to that holiness as we start off the book. And then we'll get into the rest of the book of Leviticus in next week's readings. So there you are, end of Exodus, beginning of Leviticus. Again, it's going to be tough, but I encourage you to work your way through it. And hopefully these ideas help us place some of what's going on to a bigger picture of the story of the Old Testament. All right, thanks.